In a formative period of my life, when I was ages 6 to 10, we lived in Delaware, Ohio. And I was recently thinking about where we lived. And you know, when you think about that nowadays, you go to Google, right? And you can Google your old address. And I was thinking about the home that I was living in during those years of 6 to 10 years old. 199 North Washington Street. Go ahead and Google that, Delaware, Ohio, and you'll find where I lived. And the street, you know, when you put it in the satellite version of Google, you'll see exactly where I grew up. I thought that street was a lot larger than that when I was a kid at that age. I have some other pictures. We lived a block away from this church, Asbury Me Church, which you realize is Methodist Episcopal. That's what I thought it was actually about me when I was that age. And I remember looking up at that church tower at Asbury United Methodist Church, just a block away from our church. That's going to be my last slide of remembering. I could bring up my dog Brownie if you'd like, John. I know he loves a good slideshow like that. But in that recollection time and remembering my church of my growing up years, I remember sitting in the pew with my family. My father was studying to be a pastor, so he was in the choir at that time. He wasn't a pastor of this particular church. He was studying to become a pastor. My mom gave my brothers and I the opportunity that when we were sitting in the pew, we could bring one Matchbox car, and we could use that. I think I damaged some part of a pew running it along the back of a pew. I have fond memories of those years at Asbury United Methodist Church. If I was asked at that age what the climax or the most important moment in worship was, I would have said, and maybe you would agree with me, from the point of view of a child, what's the kind of the most dramatic moment? I would have said it was the offering. Right? The offering, there's all this action, the ushers come, there's the plates being passed, and in my family, the youngest, which I was, got to put the offering in the plate, so there was some action for me to be a participant in. And then there was that crescendo before the doxology, and we all would stand and rise. You'd think that there was no question that that's the highlight of the worship service, especially from a kid's point of view. That's the dramatic time of giving one's money. So as a young child, I thought that everybody just must love giving money. It's just, everybody has no problem with giving money to the church. You'd think that that kind of, in effect, saying that what we have is not ours to keep but ours to give would make it easy for a conversation about money in the church. But church folks aren't exactly that easy to talk about, this topic of money. Preachers tend to try to avoid it if we can in talking about or using a message that centers on money. It's one of the more difficult messages to address as pastors and congregations, finance committees, to talk about giving to the church. It's kind of like when you go to visit a dentist. Which, by the way, I'm still looking for a dentist. I haven't figured that out in relocation terms. When you go to the dentist, you know you need to, but you just hope it won't be too painful, right? That's the kind of how we come to a stewardship Sunday. We hope that it's not too painful when the preacher starts talking about money. We could have the ushers kind of pass some Novocaine around, laughing gas, something that would make it a little easier to talk about this topic of financial gifts. And wasn't it just a month ago that the preacher, me, offered a sermon on financial gifts, right? That was just a month ago. You're kind of wondering, the new preacher is just a little bit kind of focused on this topic. It's a little bit crazy that he's bringing it up. Well, it is the season, and that is in part why we address Stewardship Sunday again this Sunday. The thing is, I'm in good company when it comes to bringing up money. It turns out that Jesus spoke more about money than he did about God's love. When I heard that from a preacher years ago, I kind of questioned it. I was like, no, that can't be right. That Jesus talked more about money than he did about God's love and God's salvation. But sure enough, I went and did a lot of research, and that's exactly the case. More often, the topic is found that Jesus spoke about money and about how we use our wealth than he did about heaven or hell or about God's love. I think God's love is exactly the center of the message of who Jesus Christ came to be. God's love is the central message, but even Jesus spoke about money more than he did God's love. Money is so important because it reveals something about who you and I are. It says something about our commitments and what is important in our lives. Even so, we're a bit squeamish when it comes to the topic of money and giving to the church. And in our Bible story this morning, the widow's offering, in our reading from the Gospel of Mark, it brings up more questions than it does easy answers. At least it does for me as I have looked at it in preparation for our message today. How much does one give after you read this story? What's the obligation of concerning giving to the church and to the work of God? Should I feel guilty because I don't give it all away like the widow? Listen with me for the word of God found here in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verses 38 through 44. As Jesus taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." Jesus sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. And then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." Thanks be to God for this reading of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So you see what I mean by our fear of discussion about money is not really helped by this particular story. It's not an easy one to necessarily understand and interpret as to how we should give and what our generosity should look like. Our fears in discussing money in the church arise because in parts there's a fear we will somehow be manipulated, that there'll be a kind of a sales pitch to the point where we will do something that we would rather not do, or that we're not able to afford in our budget, or that we will be made somehow to feel guilty that we're not willing to give at the level that is being asked of us. I like the story of Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was once able to hear a famous preacher by the name of George Whitefield. I guess Franklin liked to go and hear some of the great orators of his day, and he heard that George Whitefield was going to be in Philadelphia, and so he decided to go hear this Whitefield. Whitefield was a contemporary and a friend of John Wesley. In fact, he was one that John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, that is Whitefield, encouraged Wesley to preach in the outdoors. Wesley had never done that before, and he began to do so because of his friendship with Whitefield. Well, Whitefield came to Philadelphia, and Franklin evidently had heard about his coming to preach. And Whitefield was one of those preachers that could make grown men cry by just pronouncing the word Mesopotamia. See, I don't have it, but Whitefield did, evidently. You could just say that word, and he had the congregation mesmerized by his skill. Whitefield, on this occasion, was soliciting funds for an orphanage in Georgia, and so Franklin was determined that he would resist his appeals, and he writes about this in his diary. Franklin's words: "I happened soon after to attend one of his sermons, in the course of which I perceived he intended to finish with a collection, an offering, and I silently resolved he should get nothing from me." So Franklin had in his pocket, though, he had some copper copper money, evidently, and he also had 3 or 4 silver dollars, and he had a few gold coins as well. As Whitefield proceeded, Franklin goes on to say, I began to soften. I concluded I'd give him the copper. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed of that, and I determined I would give him the silver. And then he finished so admirably, I emptied my whole pocket, gold and all, into the collector's plate. Franklin had heard the message of Whitefield that what we have is not ours to keep, but an opportunity for us to give. Whitefield was able to move Franklin from a complacent observer, a spectator, to one who is willing to act and to give of himself. To me, that's what the Gospels are all about, moving us from being spectators to being folks who are actors of the faith. Those who observe and then act on what we've encountered. The gospel is intended to motivate that. And I like, recently, Pastor Matt and I were teaching the disciples' path. By the way, I send greetings from Pastor Matt. He's on vacation. I guess I gave him my birthday off. And he's giving you greetings from duck camp, as he would call it, duck camp. He's a duck hunter. Matt and I were teaching Disciples' Path, and one of the topics is around worship and the importance of worship and being present in the church. And in that study, there's a quote from Soren Kierkegaard, which, by the way, if you're naming a kid, Soren would be a good one. I kind of like Soren. We didn't do that in our case, but Soren Kierkegaard said something about worship and the aspect of how we should see ourselves in worship. He said most churches and most people, when they think about worship, they think about the fact that they are a part of an audience. The congregation's the audience, and the people who are leading worship, pastors, organists, choir, bell choir, all those folks, worship leaders, they are directing the audience, and that God then is there to offer guidance to the whole thing. So the actors, I should say, the actors are the worship leaders, and God is directing the whole show, and the audience is looking to those who are trying to entertain them. So that puts the pastor in this role of entertainer. Kierkegaard said a better way to look at worship, and I have to say this is a really good way of understanding worship. The audience is God. The audience is God, that we are worshiping God, that the worship leaders are directing, helping us with putting ourselves in connection with that audience of God. And then finally, the way that we understand ourselves, the whole congregation, we are the actors. We are expected to not be entertained, but we are to take what we hear and what we observe, what we understand, and share that going forward. We become the actors on this worship. God is the audience. Well, back to Mark. If we look at the weaving together of these stories in the Gospel of Mark, you'll find that as a writer, he's about as good as a director would be in a movie, right? He's a Steven Spielberg of his day, the way that the Gospel of Mark is written. Take a look at these 2 verses and just how they would read as a script. Jesus sat down opposite the treasury, watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Rich people put in large sums. You can see how this could all be acted out, right? A poor widow came, put in 2 small copper coins. And then he called his disciples and said to them. See how it reads just like a play script would read, giving you the action of what is occurring in the setting the stage. And in those 4 verses, and then in what Jesus says in this story, it makes us struggle with our stewardship and our attitude towards giving. We are directed to look at the widow as an example, as someone to imitate, as an icon, if you will. Now, the closest that I get to an icon is on my computer. Perhaps you have a computer as well. And when you click on the icon, right, it opens up the program that you're going to be using. This is not my actual computer screen, mind you. This is like really old. I don't have TurboTax. But at any rate, you get the idea. The computer screen uses these icons to help us get to something beyond them. I think that's the right way to look at what an icon does. Our Greek Orthodox friends, they have icons all over their worship space. And when I was younger, I didn't understand that. I thought they were idols. And I thought, that's something we're not, that's like one of the top 10 not to do kind of things, is to have an idol. But they understand them to be icons. Icons that help them point towards something greater than what we are looking at. Friends, I'd suggest to you that the story of the widow's offering is exactly that, an icon. Points us to something greater, something that we understand more fully by looking at how she is an example for us. One even gets the impression that for Jesus and the disciples observing the widow's offering, the widow is an icon that reveals something to imitate and to follow. The widow is indifferent as she is depicted in this story. She's indifferent to the typical human desires for security and wealth and status. She places her faith in God and not in human wealth. In effect, as an icon, she reveals that what we have is not ours to keep, but ours to give. And Jesus is upholding her as one to follow, to imitate. And so we learn from this icon of the widow's offering that the giving is not an isolated event. It is a way of discipleship. It is one component in living a God-centered life. It's one component of being a follower of Christ. John Wesley understood this approach of the widow and believed that all we have and that all we are is a gift from God. Here's a couple of sayings from John Wesley as he understood it. The proper use of money is the only advantage there is in having it. The proper use. He said we should gain all we can or get all we can. We should save all we can, and then we should give all we can. At first glance, this is kind of a compulsive kind of phrasing that Wesley has, but when you understand that Wesley understood that all of it belongs to God in the first place, then we understand that the Christian as steward, in Wesley's view, is meant to steward all that they have. Even their food and clothing, their shelter are a part of what they are giving to God. However, that basic needs of Wesley were exactly that, just food, clothing, and shelter. When he understood that we were rich, if we at least met those needs, if we had anything left over, he understood that you were wealthy to be able to have more than just food, clothing, and shelter. He considered persons to be rich who had something left over. And that's a difficult, challenging model to follow as Methodists, as the one who started the movement was able to offer all that he had. But consider this. We have about 350 families that give to our congregation, and their financial generosity makes a difference throughout the year. Pastor Matt and I are doing some study of demographics for our area as kind of lead up to our visioning experience next Sunday afternoon. And we did a study of just a 5-mile radius of this address. And you can get that information from census data. And it shows that the median income for this 5-mile radius around our church is $57,000, just a little over that. $57,000 for a household income is the median, which is the right number to look at. If you're into statistics, median's the right thing because 50% make more than that and 50% make less than that. So the median's better than the average, which would be much, much higher. The classic way of looking at the church, you'll often hear pastors say, you need to give 10%. Consider giving 10% to the church. So that's $5,700. That would be typically the ask of what you would give to the church. You realize if we did that, 350 families, do the math, you're over $2 million. Our budget's like $750,000, I think. To $2 million if we actually got the 10%. You know what that means, though. If you just have it be 5%, I know I'm not supposed to say that, John. I'm supposed to say 10%, right? But 5% would be $1 million. We're still trying to figure out how to give away like a couple $100,000 there. We could dream about new ministries. We could dream about some revitalization opportunities that would be important to our congregation. And in fact, if we just even gave 4%, we'd actually meet the budget with ease, and we wouldn't have these conversations every year. If we had just that portion of money, we could dream in new ways. We could dream about a full-time youth minister instead of part-time youth ministers. We could talk about upgrading the fellowship hall for the transformation contemporary worship to be at its best. We could do things like having a coordinator for family ministries again. We could certainly use someone like Leslie Thoma again in our church, someone who's looking at people's spiritual gifts and identifying them and helping them uncover that. That would be such a gift to be at that point again. It boils down to the fact that what we have is not ours to keep, but ours to give, that we give a portion, a percentage of that back to the work of our church. Now, if we limit our view to just this story of the widow's mite, or the widow's offering in this story, we would miss another discipleship opportunity and a theme that's found in this particular passage of Scripture. Not only are the disciples to be good stewards of their resources, as the icon of the widow's offering offers, the disciples are also to form a community that advocates and supports one another. I find this because of what Jesus does to set up that story of the widow's mite experience. He talks about the scribes, and he talks about in the preceding story that we find Jesus speaking about how the scribes have devoured the widow's houses. It's a reference to the fact that they are not advocating and caring for the needs of the widows. In that day and age, if there was not a family that helped support the widows, it was expected that the members of the synagogue and the temple would be there on their behalf. And they were evidently not doing that. They were using their money for their own gain. And so he refers to them devouring the widows' offerings and their gifts. The community has an obligation to the widow, and the gospel story calls for disciples to challenge the community and to change and to renew the way that they care for one another. So that too is a part of this passage and its story. Here at First Church, we can follow the lead of this gospel message to continue to minister to the needs of our community in the ways that we already do, but there could be new opportunities and new ways that we could reach out and advocate for the needs of others. We can be an icon for the Cedar Valley in more ways than we have been. An icon that shares God's grace and meets the needs of our world locally and globally. We're going to move from being spectators to being actors of the gospel message that we receive. Together we can respond with our lives, with our giving of our time, talents, and as well our money. Let's make our commitment, for what we have is not ours to keep, but ours to give.
This has been a broadcast of the First United Methodist Church in Cedar Falls. We're glad you joined us. We're here to help you on your journeys of life and faith. We gather for worship services and classes, support groups, and just for fun groups, and you're welcome at any one of them. Just show up and say, "Hi, I'm new here," and we'll take it from there. You can learn more about our church at aboutfirst.com, and you can follow us on Facebook and YouTube too. If you can't make it in person, we'll be right here on your TV at this same time next week. We'll see you then.